Welcome to the Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventure games. I'm Jason Compton. We talk a lot about games on this podcast, but this is an interview episode where we're talking with somebody who, in addition to creating several modern works of interactive fiction, is one of the most prolific reviewers of interactive fiction and text adventures the world has ever known. We're speaking with Mathbrush, who goes by Brian Rushton in his civilian life, talking about how he got involved in text adventures, the thousands of reviews that he's created. He's a really fascinating character. I want to take you to our conversation right now. And we're here on the Retro Adventures this time around speaking with Brian Rushton, perhaps better known as Mathbrush. We talk about the interactive fiction database, IFDB, quite a bit on the program, and we link to it for most of our games. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say you can't visit IFDB for very long without seeing the name Mathbrush, because he has his fingers in thousands, literally thousands of pages. He's written well over 24 games. Brian, thanks for taking the time. Welcome to the program.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
So before I get into all those extensive credits, I should just back up for the portion of the audience that doesn't know you. Maybe they don't spend as much time on IFDB or the InFic forums or just kind of the trappings of the modern IF scene. Can you give us a little bit of background, just sort of your connection to text adventures generally, and then we can kind of talk about the review work a little bit later?
Yeah, no problem. I still think of myself as a relative newcomer because a lot of the people in the community have been there since the 80s, but I recently got into interactive fiction in the 2010s. And my main point of entry was reviews. I remember I learned about the Infocom games, and I'm like, I want to see what people have to say about them. But surprisingly, at that time, there's very few reviews about them on IFTB specifically. So I thought this seems like a kind of a niche that I can fill. So that's where it got started. Since then, I've worked a lot with the interactive fiction competition. And just like any community, the longer that you're in, the more tasks kind of get assigned to you. So I've also ended up being an admin for IFDB, and I helped recently to take over Spring Thing, which is a large competition from Aaron Reed, who had to retire from running it. So that's mainly what I do. I write the games, I review the games, and I help run some of the competitions.
The Infocom games were your on-ramp? Was that sort of your gateway, or had you played others before you got to Infocom?
When I was a kid, I tried Zork for like 10 minutes, but when I was like 7, I had no clue what I was doing. In 2010, when the iPad came out for the first time, I wanted to try it, and there wasn't that many apps, so I thought, I wonder if they have Zork on here, and I found an app called Frauds. I don't know if you know about it.
Yeah.
And it had a starter pack, about 20 games, including Zork, but the one that really caught my attention was called Curses by Graham Nelson. Mm-hmm. And I just loved that game. It was just really shaped me. And so I had to take a break from interactive fiction at the time because I'd just gotten married and my life was really changed a lot. But 5 years later, I re-downloaded the app and I thought, I have a little more money now. I'm out of college. I'm going to try buying the Lost Treasures of Infocom. Is that what it was called?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And I just loved it. Really great games. I love Spellbreaker. I loved all of those. But that was my entry to the community because I was looking for the reviews and couldn't find them.
You know, IFDB shows on public profiles when that member joined, and it shows activity. So I can't help but notice Mathbrush member since April 5th, 2015. And if we look at those reviews, and at the time of this interview in spring 2025, it's just shy of 3,500 reviews. But the very first one, published, perhaps not coincidentally, on April 5th, 2015, is for Curses, as you mentioned. So did you join, knowing like I've got this review of Curses ready to roll, or was it when you joined, you saw the power and you're like, all right, I'm gonna hammer this out? How did that play out?
I believe it was the first that I was just excited to tell other people how much I cared about Curses. It was just an amazing game. Although I thought for a very long time that it was stylized to have an exclamation point at the end of the name, like Curses. And I used that everywhere in all of my reviews and all the forums until somebody pointed out about a year or two ago that it doesn't actually have one.
I think I was also part of that, mass hallucination or whatever, because, that felt right. I remember, seeing that conversation. So, I think we all just convinced ourselves that that's what it was. So yeah, we can see some of those. Unfortunately, IFDB has a lot of sorting tools. I'm sure there'd be a way to dig this out of the database, but I didn't go that far. I can sort by the date that you submitted them, not by the age of the game. It does look like in that early period you're covering what I kind of call the start of that post-commercial period. Curses, Anchorhead, Jigsaw. Endless Nameless. We're getting a little bit into theater, kind of those bigger games of the 90s, I would say, when the commercial period had ended. You said that the Infocom games were kind of your entry point. Now that you've spent, now we're just a little bit over 10 years of you reviewing these games, do you think about the different, like when you sit down just gauging by the age of a game, do you have a sense I know what I'm going to be in for just based on when it was published? Or, do you, with your thousands of games that you've looked at, do you have a different approach to, setting your expectations?
No, absolutely, absolutely. I even have like informal names for them in my head. Like I remember writing a review recently, and I called something the Silver Age of interactive fiction. I thought, I don't know if I've ever like told anyone that's what I think of it as, because I think of the Infocom games, which are very polished and beautiful and very poetic. And at the same time, we had a lot of games that were like a lot of educational games that were designed for younger kids, and they had simpler. I'm kind of thinking of Scott Adams, but his are actually fairly complex. But the head of the school I teach at now, when she was younger, she ran a camp where she taught kids how to write interactive fiction in the 80s. She passed away recently. So there's like two classes of games back then. And so when I play a game from back then, I don't know which one it's going to be, but between like the super polished and like the more, can I say, janky a little bit? But I have an expectation of both, and I love both. Then when you think of stuff like right after, I think of there's a Dark Ages period. That's like when TADS was really popular. And have you played that CompuServe game by
Uh,
Judith Pintar?
I know of it, but I have not played it.
Yeah, like I think of that era as like they had great games. I think it was the Dark Ages because the community itself wasn't really big at the time.
Yeah.
And then you have TADS, and then you have what I think of like as the Silver Age kind of. That's when Infocom got developed, and then you have all the four. I think of the four big IF authors. So you may not know this, but it would make sense for my reviews. I'm absolutely obsessed with statistics about interactive fiction.
Okay.
So one statistic is there's exactly four authors, each of which have won IF Comp and have won two XYZZY awards. And those are John Ingold, Emily Short, Andrew Plotkin, and Adam Cadre or Cater. I don't know how to actually say his last name. So I think of those four as the big four, and they all got their start around then. So I think of that as the Silver Age, and there's a huge emphasis on mechanics and systems and trying to model things, because computers at the time were far too weak to model stuff accurately graphically. So people like Emily Short were really trying hard to model physics in interactive fiction with the hope of one day getting better computer simulations through other means. Like interactive fiction was like a stepping stool kind of.
Interesting.
And then I think of another weak point. I pinpoint around 2009 as being another mini dark age, or maybe like the Great Depression, where a lot of the games just weren't as high quality. A lot of the people dropped out of the community. And then when Twine came back, it actually caused a resurgence in parser games because so many people flooded in with Twine. And then they're like, well, other people seem to respect parser more, so I'll move into that. Like authors like Chandler Groover, for instance, who started with Twine and wanted more community interaction, so switched to parser games. And so that's kind of like the what I think of in my head.
Interesting. I don't think I was aware of the dynamic. I knew about Twine, which for our listeners who are deeply embedded in the retro period, Twine is a contemporary language for developing choice games primarily, and I knew that it had brought an influx of talent. What I didn't realize so much was the talent moving in the other direction. Because notably, if I've got my facts right, Twine was developed by Chris Klimas, who was an Informed developer. So writing in the old Infocom format.
That's
and
right.
Then and I remember some of those games kind of bumping up against like, well, does this quite fit this format? And then it looks like Chris just said, like, how about I come up with this instead? And then a lot of people were very happy. So
yeah, another example of the reverse direction is SV Linwood, who entered the scene with a Twine game called A Long Way to the Nearest Star 3 years ago, but won with a IF comp with a parser game the next year, Dr. Ludwig and the Devil, and won Spring Thing this year with a parser game called Cut the Sky.
interesting. Okay, yeah, I don't think I was aware of that trend. Interesting. So And I'm just inferring from things that you said, I think you're a little bit younger than the typical hosts of Retro Adventurers. When you're taking a look at these parser games in the 2010s, 2010 kind of rediscovering Zork and then moving on from there. We can argue about how accurate physical simulations were, but there were plenty of other games to play. So, what has kept you coming back to these games and sort of staying so immersed in this world?
Well, I'd say there's probably three things. One is just the size of the community. Some communities are just so small. Like my son was involved in the community for a game called Sprunky, which is a horror game on itch. And it's just one game that lasts like 10 minutes. And so the community was there for a few months, then died because there's no content. But then you have things like movies or video games in general, which there's just so much put out, you'll never get a hold of it. So what I liked about interactive fiction was the idea that it was just barely possible to play everything. Like, and that's gotten a little bit harder over time. I'm kind of losing sight of that dream, but that's kind of what got me into it, is that I can completely understand this area. Was that was
Okay.
the hope.
Interesting. So yeah, let's talk about the span of 10 years. And I mean, obviously you do review a lot of new works. It's pretty common to see a game will get listed on IFDB. It doesn't take necessarily too long. It's not a guarantee, but you often do review those games. But when it comes to the back catalog, which as you say is finite, but there are still games being discovered or preserved for the first time, or somebody digs it up out of an Eastern European market where software preservation didn't spread as far. So how do you decide what am I going to play next from the backlog?
Oh, that's a great question. I started with looking for the best of all games. I love getting into a new hobby and just looking the best of everything, 'cause it's so fun for the first few months. Like opera, you listen to all the best operas, or the SCP archive, read all of the best SCPs. So I played every XYZZY winning game, and then the top three of all IF Comp games. And I was like, well, what about the top 10 IF Comp games? And then eventually I played every single IF Comp game except for about five. I can actually search right now. Snag. Okay, more than five. 39, but a lot of those are mine. I don't play a lot of sexually explicit games, and then there's a few others which I wasn't able to recover. But one thing I found that was so interesting in finding these games, just going through these lists, was I started learning more from the bad games. Because good games, they just make it look so easy. But then bad games, it's easy to see like, oh, I don't like this. And you can think, oh, I'm not going to do that. So I started specifically looking for bad games for a while, just through IF Comp. Then after that, I went back and I looked at every XYZZY nominated game ever. Currently, I'm still working my way through all the old Spring Thing games. I still haven't finished all of those.
Okay. And because you're a little more immersed in this world than I am, like I've been part of the scene since there's been an IF comp, but I don't always keep super close track of all the awards and competitions. So for the audience, can you kind of break down like what's the difference between IF comp and Spring Thing, and what do the XYZZY or ZZY awards, what do those represent?
Sure. Would it be okay if I talk about like the 4 or 5 biggest competitions, including those and then two others?
Yeah, please.
Okay, yeah. So in 1993, Inform had just come out as a way to write in the same kind of language or not the same language, the same kind of output that Infocom used,
Right.
which was a big deal because Infocom had ported interpreters to every single format. So making a game with Inform can just instantly work on every single computer and format because you just have to port the interpreter and all of the virtual machine files work right away. Anyway, so that started in 1995. As the competition started as a way to promote the use of Inform. The TADS language at the time was the second most popular, and they felt kind of left out, so they added a TADS division. And the next year, this allowed anybody to enter. Yeah. But IFComp has been kind of like the signature platform for interactive fiction delivery for the last 30 or so years. It comes with cash prizes. People end up in museums from it. Porpentine's work ended up in the Whitney Biennial. Many people have gotten jobs from it. I've gotten book deals from it. So that's the signature premier place. We also, countering that, there's the XYZZY Awards, which was started by Eileen Mullen, I believe, in 1995. And it was a way to, or actually it was 1996, but for games made in 1995. My apologies. 1997 for games made in 1996. I always remember there's a year gap between the first IF Comp game and the first XYZZY winner. And the point of that was to be basically the Oscars of the community, where we would award people for the greatest things inside or outside of competitions. And over the years, that's been really big. I feel like it's more of an honor even than comp winning. One of my biggest dreams is always to be nominated for an XYZZY Best Game. Never happened, but I think that's part of what's driven me to move forward. Outside of those two, the emphasis became more and more on short games over time, and people felt kind of like they're lacking the longer ones. So Spring Thing was created as a counterpart to IFComp, specifically to host large games and to be about 6 months away from IFComp to give a new chance to showcase things that didn't fit into the IFComp format. It was very small over the years, only 2 to 3 games some years, and some years none at all, until Aaron Reed took it over around a decade ago and significantly improved it, revamped it, made it a beautiful website. And now it's very large. We had more than 30 games this last time, and I'm the one that's in charge of it right now. Outside of those three, the other biggest competitions are surprisingly a competition called Ectocomp, which was originally designed, this is very niche, for Halloween-themed games using the Adrift interactive fiction writing language for games written in 3 hours or less. Over time, it branched to accept games written in any system, and it now has 2 divisions, one for large and complex games and one for short and quickly made games. And I think one reason it's taken off so much is because horror just works really well with interactive fiction, because you can use your imagination, right? That what you can't see is more scary than what you can see.
Sure.
So those are probably the 4 biggest competitions: Spring Thing, IFComp, XYZZY Awards, and Ectocomp. I do have to say the XYZZY Awards, the previous runner of them had some trouble, and it ended up becoming later and later every year. It started in February, then it got to May, then it got to June, July, and August, and finally to December. And so the community was getting stressed out about it. And I offered to help take them over, but they didn't really want to at the time. So what I did is I made a new awards called the IFDB Awards, just to kind of plug the hole for the community for a little bit. Not to take over XYZZY Awards, but just to have a place for them to vote early in the year while they're waiting for it to come out. And so we've run that the last 3 years, and it's been pretty fun. The XYZZY Awards are being handed off to a new person. That person also happens to have a lot of emergencies this year, so it's about a year and a half late right now. But we all hope it'll go well in the future.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, something from 2022, 2023, that's way new for retro adventure stuff. But yeah, good to get the overview there. Thank you for that. Yeah, so you also started writing games, it looks like, in 2015 as well. Looks like you were using Inform 7, at least for the early ones that I've seen here. Can you talk a little bit about how your interest as a reviewer fed into, okay, this is now what I'm going to write? You know, were you writing for the audience of the day? Were you kind of writing for what you thought players like you might like? Or were they just the stories and puzzles and experiences in you that you wanted to get out there? What was that thought process?
That's a great question. My first 2 games, Ether and Color the Truth, I mean, they were my first 2 largest games. I had a few very small games released as well. Were both designed to plug what I felt was a hole in the interactive fiction canon. Looking through all interactive fiction games, I tried to find things I thought they did very poorly and tried to figure out a way to make a game that could make it do well. Ether, for instance, was designed to have 3D movement. Most games I found struggled with 3D movement. They don't have it at all, or it's very complex. But in Ether, you're a floating alien in a grid that's 5 by 5 by 5. And there's like things falling and moving every turn and shifting around. And your commands are mostly things like northeast up, for instance, to move in 3-dimensional space. So that was the thought process there. With Color of the Truth, I found there's been a lot of debate over the years on different conversational methods. And I was thinking, well, conversation, people say they've never figured out in Inform. So I'm going to do what Inform's best at with inventory. And I'm going to make a conversational system based on inventory where you physically could hold and drop or mix together your conversational topics. And that ended up becoming my game, Color the Truth. Over the time, I've used that conversational system in every game up until the modern day. And a lot of people like it. It has basically, over time, I realized it's shifted and gotten sanded down until now it's very similar to other conversation systems. It's basically just a glorified topics list. But one thing I've did with it was allow you to combine topics. So if you have clues in a murder mystery, for instance, I've done 3 murder mysteries like this. If you see size 12 shoes and you know someone has size 12 shoes, you can combine those 2 thoughts together to get a clue against a person. And that's been copied by a few different people. There was a game about solving your own murder as a ghost, where the person copied that system, and then somebody else copied the system from that game. So that's probably the one thing I've done that's had the most lasting influence in the community. Since that, almost my games have just been greatest hits type things. My game Absence of Law in 2016 was literally just a collection of all my favorite puzzles from other interactive fiction games. And they're all cited in there. They have classic retro style puzzles. Like there was one about seeing a monster in a well in an old game that I loved. There's another old retro game where you place an eyeball on a desk rolling around that I thought was so fun. So I have a puzzle in Absence of Law where you play a little toy robot turning around on a desk. So that's mainly where I've been getting my ideas from recently, is just looking at my favorite things I've seen in the past.
Okay. Any MIT graduate engineering puzzles in the Infocom tradition as well, then, I presume?
There's so much MIT stuff in interactive fiction. It's very funny. What's that thing that they do? Is it called Stacks or something? There's something every year where there's like a competition where like it used to be they'd stack stuff in front of
Oh,
doors.
I have heard of this, yes.
Yeah, several games have been based off of that. Ryan Veeder, one of his most popular games that doesn't get talked about a lot but is highly rated on IFTP, is called the Lurking Horror 2, which is
Mm,
and it's complete. It was made for one of those stacks
okay,
events.
interesting. So yeah, you talked about conversational mechanics as something that maybe has never quite become settled law, and something that we spend some time talking about on Retro Adventures. Because we bounce around from year to year, we're not going chronologically, but so we're able to sample some of these experiments kind of as they're happening. We played the game Red Hawk, which instead of being a traditional text graphics display, it was doing comic panels, and there was nothing that was obviously wrong about that. It just didn't turn out to be a winning formula. A game that I can't wait till we get to Star Trek: The Kobayashi Alternative tried to say, well, what if we just made text input conversational speech, and every other mechanic happened as a keyboard command? And the answer was no, that's also terrible. Don't do that. But you, being somebody that has reviewed just so many games, you've seen a lot of experiments, both those that were part of commercial games, that people were being asked to pay money for, and then over the past 30 years, lots and lots of people experimenting with form. What does it mean to get descriptions on a screen? What does it mean to enter text commands? Who are you anyway? All that.
Yeah.
So are there things like, are there those experiments that, whether they're from the classic period or contemporary, but particularly classic, I'd be interested to hear ones that you were like, that really worked. It's a shame that experiment didn't catch on, or others that you've seen that made you kind of twitch an eyebrow and wonder how they got there and why they were charging money for it.
No, I love, like you said, those experiments. I love especially seeing things like Scott. Have you played much Scott Adams?
I've played some of them. I don't think I've actually played all, whatever, 13
Yes.
plus the Quest probes. We played
Yeah, he's got a
we
lot.
played Quest Probe Spider-Man, and we played through the X-Men fragment, I guess, to the best of our ability, and I've played a few here and there.
Yeah, I mean, back then you could have people like with his games, like this is the first time anyone's ever done blank. And it can be simple as the first person to ever make a Wild West game or something like
Right.
that. But when you're talking about mechanics, there were so many offshoots that were created and then discarded. One of the biggest things that I saw is people really disliked for a long time anything choice based or menu based. So
Hmm.
like you could have games with it for sure. There would be some with it, but if you had like menu based conversation, a lot of people in the mid '90s. I'm not as familiar with the late '80s as you are, but with the mid '90s, early '90s, anything that had any kind of choice or option, they said they don't like that. The at that time the true mark of a great game was having like you have to guess the topics, right? You're talking to somebody in conversation, you have to ask about the right thing, and finding the right topics to ask about was good or bad. And when that works well, it works well. The game Galatea, for instance, has hundreds of topics it can do, but if you don't implement that well, it's just so frustrating. It's basically taking the entire human dictionary and trying to guess which 9 or 10 words did the person happen to choose. So there
Right.
were a lot of choice-based options back at the time. There was one author, for instance, named Papillon. This was in the '90s, who wrote an entirely choose your own adventure style inform game about called Desert Heat, about
Okay.
falling in love in the desert, and it was panned. It was really marked down. Nowadays, she's a very successful visual novel reviewer and developer because tastes have changed, right? Nowadays, choice-based stuff is a lot more popular. Similarly, like you said, Chris Klimas and other people, there was quite a few attempts to make choice-based style games throughout the 90s that were looked down on, but now I think would be received much more highly.
Yeah, something that we've run into a couple times, and I don't know that I've ever seen anybody in the community championing it. I mean, there may be somebody, is real-time input. That's actually a part of Red Hawk as well, and there have been some other games
Yeah.
where it's timed, not just you've got a set number of moves, but you've got a set number of seconds to enter this next command. So you, who have reviewed so many games, have you seen timed input done well?
Not really. Well, I'll say this. So I played Border Zone by Mark Blank,
Mm.
and I struggled with that having the timed input because one reason I got into text adventures specifically, not other genres, is I've always lived in small houses next to near my family. I live in apartments, and a lot of them are very uninterested in the games. And I often very busy. I have a disabled son. I like to help take care of him. So I need something that I can just pick up and drop at any moment. I can have it in the background. There's no disturbances. There's no cutscenes. If I'm in the middle of something, I can just say, okay, I'm stopping this interactive fiction game and coming back. With the timed input, it's just so frustrating. It takes away all of that aspect. You have to be on your toes, and I've seen it in so many ways. I had a friend who tried an experiment 3 or 4 years ago with this, where you're a thief breaking in, and if you take too long in the game, they'll come and catch you. And it's supposed to be a surprise, like no one had done this in a long time. So it's like, whoa, an inform game this whole time was tracking your speed. So it's a really cool idea. It just wasn't very fun in practice.
Mhm.
We also have had a few developers over the years. There's a very specific genre. I don't know if it's one guy with 20 different names or it's just a whole genre of people that will make these really very cool looking Q basic games that have green text and like cool flashy backgrounds, and they always have a timer at the top. This is like 30 minutes and starts counting down. And the maps usually there's like usually no puzzles or anything. It's just like a maze, and you go around it to the end. And I just never got the timer. I don't know that there's got to be more than 40 to 50 games like that on IFTV.
Okay. Are you saying those are contemporary games being done in QBasic, or they are from the
Yes,
80s?
yes.
Interesting.
Could I make a tangent about retro games in the modern times?
Please.
Okay, so I would actually say that the retro community that I've seen is stronger now in the last 10 years than any time in the past. In terms of people who interact with IFComp and XYZZY, looking in the past, I see a lot of people progressing towards the future and working hard at trying new things. And they kind of, oh, we've moved past all this stuff. But in the last 10 years, I've seen really successful attempts to move to reviving the work of the past. So examples of that include Puny Inform,
Yep.
which is designed to run on like Commodore 64 and other retro platforms. I've seen a lot of work with people like Hugo Lebrand, who released a commercial game that was designed to run on about 30 old-fashioned platforms, including Game Boy. Um, I've seen, what's his name? Stefan Hoffman is one. Have you ever heard of the game Hibernated that was released a few years
Yeah.
ago?
Stefan Vogt, I believe, is
Yeah,
his name. Yeah.
right. So that community, I feel, is thriving. They love old-fashioned games. They're doing a good job at making them. And that's something that I don't really see if I look in the past. If I look at 2017 or 2018 and earlier, I just don't see in the interactive fiction community that I've been part of that kind of let's recreate these features of the past. Because what's most interesting to me about the current retro community is that they seem most interested in the limitations of the past. So much as possible now, they're wondering how can we work with limited memory? How can we work with this type of conversation system? And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, and I agree. Yeah, we've talked about puny inform, and we actually we have an episode coming up soon where we actually look at a what I call the neo retro style. It's a game from just a few
That's a
years ago.
that's a great name up for that
Yeah,
style.
and Adventure On, that one got a lot of attention, and it got a lot of people, developing text adventures that otherwise, probably wouldn't have. There've been some other academics that have come up with systems, but Adventure On was one of the big successes there. I'm trying to think of other those tropes of the past that we run run into that you know, as a reviewer crossing between the present and the past so frequently, you know, things like mazes, you know,
I,
inventory limits, you know, things like that. You know, can you kind of, you know, with as many games as you've played, you know, can you pretty much, you know, point your finger and say like, that's when nobody does this anymore, and you know, spot those 3 times, you know, in subsequent years, kind of like bringing back the time-based input that people did bring it back, but where you can say like, that was clearly the end of the line for mazes. That was clearly the end of the line for inventory
oh yeah,
limits, or
definitely.
you know, being forced to drop items, you know, as they tumble out of your hands, Infocom style.
Yeah, I can think of big cutoffs. Like for like one major one is one of the most influential games in the IF comp community that's not talked about a lot is called John's Fire Witch.
Oh yeah,
Oh, you've heard it, you've played that one?
I think that was from the first or second year. It must have been.
Yeah, yeah. Because it was right around it wasn't directly entered in IF comp, it was around it.
Okay,
Up
yeah,
until that point, now since you were there, you can tell me if this is true or not. It
I'll
felt like
try.
most people were trying to make things similar in content and style to Infocom games or Magnetic Scrolls, where you could play it for 10 to 20 hours and like you could boast over your number of rooms and the number of your puzzles and details. But John's Fire Witch was designed to be solved in a couple of hours. So when I look back on Usenet for a lot of the discussion on the creation of IFComp, I see a lot of people saying, I enjoyed John's Fire Witch. Can we get more games like this that can be completed quickly?
Interesting. Yeah, I
So,
think, you know, I usually point to the change in the weather as the pivot point, you know, because Andrew Plotkin, you know, has been, he's, you know, one of the 2 most influential people of the past 30 years. And I think that
absolutely.
change in the weather had a lot to do with that. But I do, you're right, people do and did talk about John's Fire Witch. And I think that, that quick play, you know, quick solve, but it's not necessarily, you know, there's challenge to it, but it's not going to target, yeah, that 20-hour playtime or whatever. That
It's
is an
funny
important
that,
one. Yeah.
oh, sorry. It's funny that you mentioned changing weather because I was thinking of influential games. The first three games I thought were John's Fire Witch, A Change in the Weather, and Photopia.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I thought A Change in the Weather did so well that seems when I look at games before and after A Change in the Weather, it's just a huge, well, it's a change in the weather. No, it was just a paradigm shift because even the other games in that IF comp, a lot of them before, like you'd have the puzzles and you have the story, but they're not directly related. Like I play Spellbreaker. It's one of my favorite top 10 favorite games of all time, Infocom. Um, and they have the great puzzle, the great story about like, you know, magic is failing. But what are the puzzles? You have stuff like making an ogre sneeze or something like that, or you know, how do we measure these cubes? Where with a change in the weather, every puzzle just feels so directly tied to the story. Like, oh, you know, there's water is flooding this muddy ravine, and this building is going to collapse. Let's try and you know save that. Oh, there's a fox. Let's try and play with the fox. Oh, you know, we're going to get sick. We're cold. Like everything was just tied so well.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you completely. I believe that that really changed. And I think that that game made people want to make story more integrated. So much, and then you get the game Photopia, which commonly gets cited as the motivation for a lot of more puzzle-less games, where somebody made this beautiful game that has a great story and very light puzzles that almost anybody can complete. And it just made people want to do something different than the past. So those are to me the three biggest landmark games in the early community. We've had landmark games recently, but like you said, that's not as closely related to the retro stuff.
We haven't really talked about graphic adventure games much. That being a, you know, pretty important part of the scene in the '80s, and you know, has, you know, definitely fallen off. Even though the capability is certainly there to integrate graphics and text, but I feel like for whatever reasons, it hasn't really caught on too much. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I know that some Twine games are heavier on design, but I feel like not a whole lot of the parser efforts have really jumped back on that. So from your perspective, as you know, looking back to the past and reviewing those games, you know, how did those strike you, you know, just as a player? And do you think that there's some opportunity that's been missed in not using them now?
That's a wonderful question. Looking back, I think it comes down a lot to ability. My dad ran a video game company when I was growing up, and I was surprised to find out that half of his workers, about out of 100, about 50 were artists. Art is very difficult.
Hmm.
And with the early games, I remember being in sixth grade playing this really fun Alice in Wonderland graphical text adventure. And it's just so funny seeing the pixel art, and you could tell the people were not artists. Most of these people are just doing pixel art by hand, and that's kind of the charm of it. It looks fun. It makes you feel like raw, like something that's like, to me, interactive fiction is like sharing a piece of your soul with somebody. And I don't really like the polished stuff as much. It's like it's the raw, unfiltered stuff. So it's so fun to see like these janky dragons or a goofy guy holding a sword. And you're right, that kind of went away. I think one, because in the communities I'm part of, they early on modeled Infocom, which was sparing on graphics. Two, once you get graphical games, a lot of text adventures weren't seen as a means to their own. They're just seen as graphics that are available are bad. So we'll just use words because they're better. But once graphics got better, a lot of people felt there's no need for the text adventure. And so, for many, many reasons, they kind of fell to the wayside. But I've noticed recently with AI, the number of illustrated parser games has gone up significantly because I think it's the same thing as in the past. In the past, there's a low barrier to entry because anybody could make pixel art if you only have like 64 pixels. I mean, there's more than that. And now that people can do it, I think more people are getting into it. You're right that in Twine, it is really there's a huge emphasis on appearance, but there it's more CSS and like animations, color style. Again, most
Mm-hmm.
people struggle finding an artist, and that's why there's so much debate right now in the community. I don't know. You could have a whole podcast episode on the debates over AI use in interactive fiction.
Yeah.
But I do notice that now that it's more available for people to get custom art for their games, that more people are doing it. So I think it was mostly a literal skill issue. I think people just couldn't make good art.
Well, and you mentioning the automated art, and for newer games, I mean, the one that jumps to mind, and we interviewed creator Robin Raymond on episode 9. That's Kingdom of the Seven Stones, but that's a Commodore 64 game that he developed, over the past couple of years. And yeah, he did use LLM generated art, but again, that's a throwback type game. I feel like I don't see it as much from the current community. And another, we just put out a magazine issue, and there was an article from, I think it was David Lebling, and he's writing in the early 80s about kind of where Infocom and text adventures could go, and he says, yeah, things are limited now in that way that you were talking about, where 320 by 200 resolution was a pretty big deal, and he basically says, and well, not too far in the future, perhaps it will be possible to have art by, and I think he name checked like Frank Frazetta or Kelly Freas, and what I pointed out was, well, interesting that this is one of the Infocom movers and shakers putting that out there. But then when they do eventually get there and say, yes, let's have art, what they commissioned was not that. It was not what I would say was the best of the best that was available even for the still constrained platforms. They didn't go to get somebody who really could maybe make those machines sing. They did graphics that were computer graphics, and I do wonder how much
Yeah.
of that might have set things back, but hard to say.
It's so interesting what you're saying here. A couple of things. One thing that you said a few minutes ago I thought was interesting was that you're seeing more use of the new art from retro communities than you are from the mainstream community. Well, I wouldn't say mainstream. I think there's probably more retro enthusiasts out there. But my point is, I didn't notice that pattern until you pointed out, but it's true.
Mm.
Adventure On places a huge emphasis on these graphics.
Yeah.
And most people I see that are using AI art are doing it with a retro sensibility. So that's so interesting. And you're right. I've had a lot of thoughts about art in games the last few years. My biggest game ever released is called Never Gives Up Her Dead, and I made a deluxe edition of it last year that included a lot of art. I started making my own art last year, and I've been working on it a lot. I've been doing pixel art, I've been doing pencil sketches and things like that. And it's gotten to the point where I've been able to put it in a couple of my games, and then I think you're so right. Why don't people do it more? I think there's just, in some senses, a sense of people don't value the graphics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying.
Because if we wanted to people who are good at making graphics tend to just make video games, right? Because you take interactive fiction, you add graphics, you start adding a few extra controls, and boom, you're out of the interactive fiction genre to the video game genre. So what keeps people interactive fiction? I think for some people, it's a conscious, I don't know how to pronounce this word, eschewing. Is that a word?
Yeah, eschewing it. Yeah.
A conscious eschewing of graphics as a way of stepping back from the greater video game community.
Well, for you personally, have you delved into the Sierra games that did blend, real time, pixel perfect, navigation with the parser trappings, or the LucasArts Scum games where, yeah, you're moving something around, but you're essentially, building parsable commands from the on-screen menu, which clearly are descendants of the parser world, and then we kind of moved further and further away from the text elements of that. But is that something that's ever pulled you, or for you is that just going too far away from kind of the core?
Well, there's two reasons I play games, and one is just for personal enjoyment, and one is because I feel like it's my area. The
Mm-hmm.
games you're talking about are very fun. Growing up, I remember the Indiana Jones and the City of Atlantis. That was
Fate of
called.
Atlantis, I believe.
The
Yeah.
Fate of Atlantis was definitely one of my favorite games. I have so many vivid memories, like the really strong guy you can't beat up, so you have to push a boulder and stuff like that. And
Mm.
the opening sequence, it's variable, and you have to has like the credits coming and you get jump scared. I think those kind of games and some of the older Sierra games that blend like right on the cusp between modern video games and interactive fiction, where they had those like menu commands and things like that. I love that area. I don't play them as much myself for one reason, because there's so many excellent experts in this area, such as the digital antiquarian, and obviously you yourself are an expert in that area. I feel like it's hard to compete.
Mhm.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, like if I want to be an expert in something, I feel like people like you and other people are already filling those niches pretty well.
You talked about the sort of shift to story that started happening in that post-commercial era, where, change in the weather starts to change the way that people are thinking about creating games. What about the games from that commercial period that were, trying to put themselves out there and say, hey, we are telling a story that's a step above, hey, let's go raid a dungeon, things like Amnesia, or the very controversial Real Life, which was, trying to, tell a lot of very, heavy moralistic tales.
Yeah.
It was setting itself apart, though, and in very different ways. They were both saying, hey, this is not about, collecting, 20, treasures and dropping them in a room. We're going to tell you something about life here.
So I think that some games in the 80s had beautiful stories that I mean, you have some that are obvious, like The Hobbit, for instance, is based off a beautiful story, so it becomes a beautiful game. Or like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, written by the original author. To me, when I say that there's a change in the weather, it wasn't from bad to good. It was, to me, it was like from oil and water to mayonnaise. I felt like before these wonderful stories wouldn't be really quite synced up as well if they're puzzles. You have the famous
Okay.
sink soup cans in the kitchen in the game The Seventh Guest or something like that,
Sure.
where you have like these ghosts, but you have to arrange soup cans into the right order. Uh, or I think of the lurking horror from Infocom, where there's a very complex puzzle on trying to figure out how to microwave Chinese noodles. You know what I mean? Like, how do I get the door open? How do I put it
The-
in? How many minutes do I put in? Do I overcook them? Are they too cold? And so the puzzles are fun and the story is fun. What I think the big change was completely integrating those in a way that enhances both. Do you have any favorite stories from games in the 80s? Like things that like you played this like, man, like this meant something to me.
I mean, I'll give the basic answer, but it's true. Mine forever voyaging. I mean,
Right, right.
that's probably the top on my list of, yeah, they were setting out to do something that was above and beyond what was normally being done, and overall I would say succeeded. We haven't covered the game yet, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the either the heavy-handed nature, or as some people have pointed out, like, wait a minute, this is actually kind of a bad ending for Old Prism here.
Right.
But
Well, that I love that game, and so I think I'll try and listen to that episode when you cover it. You should notify me.
thank you.
But the that's actually a great example of what I'm talking about, because you have that amazing first half or first two-thirds or whatever, and then at the end you have this micromanagement puzzle of trying to release the
Yeah,
environmental system to protect yourself.
yeah.
It's just so dissociated from the earlier parts.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying, like, again, that that's bad. in some ways it can be fun because you're engaging both sides of your brain at once, and the contrast can be nice. It's just that it's just different from what happened later in
Yeah,
the.
and to that point, Amnesia, it's very difficult to explore the rich, adult as in it is written for adults, novelist quality when every three moves you're either, mugged and killed or dropped dead of hunger. Like it's very difficult to engage with it, and I'm glad of the remix that's out there, and we will get to that. But yeah, I was thinking also of there was that BTZ series, Essex and Mind Wheel and things like that. I didn't know if you had takes on that from your review work.
Some of those games I still haven't gotten to.
Okay.
A lot of the issue is availability. When I first started playing interactive fiction, I was playing on an iPad, and the only things I could really access were Inform games, and that's almost exclusively what I played.
Yeah.
So it's probably my weakest area of knowledge is non-Infocom commercial games released before 1993.
And what I'll say, and another site that we talk about a fair amount on the program is the MOCAG, the Museum of Computer Games and History. I'm garbling the name of it, but by having so many box scans and scans of feelies and stuff like that available, makes it a lot easier to engage in some of those games than it was, 20, 25, 30 years ago when, it was one thing to be able to get the binary and, play it on an emulator or whatever, but to experience it. And that's what I wanted to flow into. So, having come to the Infocom games, kind of as you did on an iPad. And there's certainly other games out there that rely on, text in the box or feelies or stuff like that.
Right.
How do you engage with those now? And do you find, and I will just say, I do have trouble engaging with this because it's so easy now to bake all of that text into a game file. There's, go into the about window and read the backstory, but I do find it doesn't sink in as well, even in that compared to something like a scanned PDF, where I can see that it's got a different form factor. When I'm reading a bunch of text just off of a front screen, it all kind of flows together for me. How have you combated that to be able to review so many of these games and not kind of be put off by that?
One of the biggest things I do, because you're right, this is a major issue, is I look at other people's experience with those, and I often feel like in their reviews and messages, and I often feel jealous. One of the greatest competition prizes I got for one of the IF comps is somebody sent me some like original feelies from,
cool.
I believe it was Zork 2. And this is going to sound very ridiculous, but I've always been most jealous of not having the experience of playing Wishbringer and having the white stone that glows in the dark.
Yeah.
Because that just sounds so cool. Even if somebody had one now, I'm sure like it wore off for over time, like the paint doesn't work anymore. So absolutely, I think it's a very different experience. So I like to experience that vicariously. I spent a lot of time reading Usenet. I probably read stuff from you on there. I spent a lot of time reading people's reviews. I do look at those scans. I listen to people's experiences with them. And I do think that's a lost art. You're so right. Like the idea of having these minimalist games have to be very sparing in their word text choices, but they come with this rich 10-page booklet detailing the history. I just really love that contrast. And with our current system of playing, in the communities I interact with most, the way it is you just release the game online and you download and you play it. You're right, we don't get that. And I don't have a good way to combat that. I think it's a sad loss. Maybe the cultural shift in the future, but we'll have to see.
You mentioning The Hobbit made me think about this, and I haven't delved in, because I just thought of asking this question now. I haven't delved into reviews to look at it, but something we talk about a fair bit on the program because the host rotation, I am, sort of born and raised and still live in America, so I've got kind of that grounding. Nick Moffat, very similar path, but he's been living in England for the past 20 years, and then the other two players are Brits. And so we have some bias in terms of what we, just kind of were indoctrinated with. And The Hobbit was kind of the touch point for lots of games with that emergent NPC behavior where they have, their kind of autonomous actions and wander around and take their own actions and sometimes get killed off screen, unless you told them to stay put and et cetera. Whereas the American games, as we talk about them, maybe there's a timetable that they kind of run on, Fong and Witness, he'll wander around the house a little bit bit, but he's not going to go off and suddenly do something quote unexpected or random. Do you have any take on that? We talked about conversation with NPCs, but what about that emergent versus prescribed behavior?
That's a great question. It's one of my favorite things to explore and see in games. And there's been so many different experiments with it. I think one of the best experiments with that is in Aaron Reed's game, Blue Lacuna, which came out
Hmm.
in around 2009 to 2010. He's a very complex NPC who I think his name is Proteus or something like that, where he has a daily schedule. We have 24 hours on this island, and every single day he has different things does. At 10 o'clock, he's off the beach gathering shells, and he'll talk to you about things based off your past interactions with them and where he's going next. And that's so amazing. Then you get things that are just awful. I played a game a year or two ago, and I don't like talking bad about games, but this was specifically a speed written game. So speed written games are always going to be a little janky. That's kind of just expected.
Hmm.
And in this game, we had like 8 different NPCs, and they all move independently. And all we're doing is like trying to do a murder investigation. You have to go find an item and confront the person, but you never know where they are. And the movement doesn't add anything to the game. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely think it's good to have the independent NPCs, but it's one of the most difficult things to pull off well. The Hobbit did it well because a lot of it was really logical. Like they had interactions, they would respond to you. I'm trying to think of other older games that I do it well. I keep thinking of Suspended, but that's not the same thing at all. That's 6 and PCs.
And they're like, yeah, it's very prescribed. Like you can set them to move in kind of overlapping fashion, but yeah, they don't take their own actions. The one that we just covered, and I'd really be interested to see you play this one, was the Philip Mitchell, who was the co-author of The Hobbit. He did a Sherlock game, and that
Oh,
has all sorts of autonomous action. And the bit that I did, which amused me, was I got Lestrade to give me his money. Like, he's described as having money on him. So I sweet talked him into giving me his money. So then he was unable to pay any of the cab drivers in the game, and they kept getting mad at him. And
wow.
like,
Now
that's
that's fun.
funny,
Yeah.
but is it art?
No, yeah, I see exactly what you're talking about. That sounds great. I've got to try that because I love Sherlock Holmes games, especially Sherlock Holmes interactive fiction games.
Play the Spectrum version because the Commodore 64 version is fatally bugged.
Thank you for the
Tell you
heads
that.
up.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way.
Well, that goes back to what I was talking about how a lot of the people in the early 2000s, and it sounds like what you're saying, it was going back all the way to the 80s, were more concerned with interactive fiction as a tool to simulate reality than as a vehicle for storytelling.
Yeah.
A lot of Emily Short's games have this. Because she's not quite retro, I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of them. Did you play Savoir Faire?
I really haven't. A lot of the stuff that comes post Plotkin, I just have a tough time sinking my teeth into, honestly.
Well, it's a very different flavor, so I
Yeah.
completely understand. It is a big dividing line. One thing that she does is she simulates physical properties. So we'll have things like a glass ball on a shelf, and you have to throw something at it. If your thing has the quality of being soft, it can't get high enough. If it's light, then it won't knock the ball off. If it's too heavy, it can't throw it.
Mhm.
A better example of that is her game Counterfeit Monkey, which is 2012. So in my mind, 2012 is very recent in interactive fiction terms.
Yeah, it
Um,
is. It is.
and in that game, you rearrange words to create other words. And instead of doing just considering all possibilities for a single item at a time, she just took the entire dictionary and implemented thousands of items. And you take anything that you can do with the words, like you have an anagram gun or a letter remover or whatever that changes it. She just looks in that list and produces that item, and that item happens to solve the problem you're in. That's great. And if not, then not. So you can have really funny stuff happen that doesn't make much sense. Like if you accidentally make the word all, everything that the game can make happens at once, and you die in like a flood of lava and stuff like that. Yeah,
That's pretty
so
good.
it's pretty fun. But yeah, that emergent gameplay really is fun. And for talking about these retro games, I do like it best in those old systems. You have stuff like Floyd in
Yeah.
Planetfall, who has some agency, and his code must be pretty minimal, but it just has some great moments.
Yeah.
Just like you're bored, you're wandering around this depressing place, and then the robot comes in, he says something funny or he does a song, and it's great. And then later on, when he has all of his other interactions and like that are more sad, like there's real sadness because he kind of felt alive from the emergent gameplay you're talking about.
Yeah. Yes, and some of that being emergent, I think some of that being very skillful writing within the constraints of the format. I think
That's
both
true.
are going on there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
to talk about your review approach more broadly a little bit, you talk about you've got the so IFTB is structured around a 5-star system for those of you listening who aren't familiar with it. And Brian, you just say like this is how I kind of give out the star system. Can you talk a little bit about how you developed that? Was that something that you knew back in April 2015? All right, this is how I'm going to do it, or how did you develop that format over time?
No, yeah, I developed it basically like the first 6 months to a year. I was just off of the vibes of the game. Overall, how do I feel this? I'm very susceptible to public pressure. So if I thought this game sucks and I come on, I see everybody else give it 5 stars, I feel like an obligation, like, oh, I can't be the only one that gives it a low grade. And similarly, if I felt like a game was really good, then everyone else gave it low stars, I feel weird. So I think the star system was more of a way to trick myself into avoiding peer pressure on times that I was really stressed out about it. Because I could say, okay, do I have something that I can point to as objective, even if it's not really objective? To explain my current system, I have 1 point for smoothness and polish. If I look at myself, is there a description of myself? If I try to pick up the sun, can I pick up the sun? Something like that. Is it, is it janky? Is it smooth? So
Mhm.
polish. The second one is descriptiveness. Is the game writing interesting or is it just completely bland? Or like, recently there's a lot of just like very generic AI generated where everything is like, and this instills within you a sense of wonder and knowledge. And you go to the next room that instills you with a sense of clarity and purpose. And so that's like so those are my first two is polish and descriptiveness. The third one is interactivity, and that's like was the main mechanic fun. So the game I always think about with this is the House on Rosewood Lane, which was around 2000, the mid 2000s,
Okay.
where the story was fun. It's about a vampire in a street, and some of the mechanics are fun, but you have to deliver newspapers to 12 different houses for 3 days in a row. And there's nothing. You just go to the next house, throw a newspaper, next house, throw a newspaper, next house, throw a newspaper. Very dull. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about with interactivity. The last two are a little bit more subjective. One of them is emotional impact. If you play something like, do you really feel something? Because some games are just beautiful, but these don't really touch you. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And then the fifth one is, would I play this again? Because there's a lot of games I have played again. Things like Anchorhead, I've played a lot. Curses, I played, 6 or 7 times.
Hmm.
And sometimes I want to see other endings, but sometimes I play through a game like, yeah, that was good, but I don't think I want to ever revisit that. So those are my 5 criteria, and I felt like they're kind of arbitrary. But a few years ago, I saw a short story writing competition, and they were rating things in different categories, and they used almost identical categories. So I thought that was pretty neat. I thought, okay, so maybe other people think this isn't the worst idea ever.
I know that it encompasses a lot of games out there, but having seen lots and lots of different ways to experiment with, what is language? What does it mean to ask about inventory or manipulate objects in the world or things like that? Are there any of those, really, kind of sideways takes on doing a parser-based game, even if it's something relatively new that you think our listeners should take a look at, knowing that they may come from a bias of, the kind of more conventional straight-ahead adventure.
So you're saying things that break away from the norms?
Yeah, but whether it's a 5-star game on the system or simply that you're like, hey, you know what, player of retro games, you should take a look at this even though it's not Zork 4.
Oh, now that's a great question. One thing that may be interesting because this is a new genre, newish. I'd say this is probably the newest trend in interactive fiction besides neo retro. They came around at the same time. Is limited parser games,
Mm-hmm.
which on one hand are completely seem opposed to retro ideals, but always seem to be made with retro puzzles in mind. The idea is that you restrict the commands, so there's only like 6 or 7 possible commands, and you see what you can do with it. So the person I think that appeal most to the retro community, specifically with this new take on the parser, is Arthur DiBianca. So what he does is pure puzzle boxes. His first game was a puzzle box. You're just in a room, and in front of you is a box with a crank on it and there's literally nothing you can do. The only command in this whole game you can use is use. It says X
Okay.
and use. So you
Mm-hmm.
use the crank and like it unfolds into different pieces. And then you'd think that the game would be incredibly boring, but you get so complex. Like you get a scene where there's little puppets in a room and there's 3 buttons and one turns the lights off and on. and one makes a thief crawl in, and one wakes up one of the sleeping people, and you got to push them in the right sequence so you can catch the thief right when he's coming. I think what he does is it seems like the parser game's useless because why do you need a parser at all if you could just have only a few verbs? Could you just have buttons? But what he does is he sneaks all the variability into the nouns because you have to remember. Oh, I forgot. 100 turns ago, a hamburger popped out, and now there's like a hungry clown that's looking for food. You have to remember this kind of stuff and keep track of it. He also had two games I think people would love. Grandma Beth Linda's Variety Box is the game I was just discussing. It was so popular with outside of IFComp community that it constituted 90% of the traffic to the IFComp servers in 2015. People are coming from all across the internet just to play this game. Two of the games I think the retro community would love would be Into the Facility and The Wand. In Into the Facility, you only use directional commands. And the idea is you're walking around this robotic lair where people are making all these different devices, and it's all about waiting and timing things. So you can like get a robot moving up and down in one direction, then you have to time another robot to come the other way to hit them right in the right spot. Or there's a loop if you go through, something turns on, you go the other way and the loop turns off. The other game is The Wand, which is you have a magic wand that has 8 rotating letters on it or colors, and as you flip the letters around, you get new spells. But what you have to do in the long run is you have to figure out to combine them. So let's say you get a spell for like polishing bronze, and you get a spell for polishing silver, and they both start with the letters like ATAY or something like that. And then later you get a spell for corroding iron, and it ends with some other 4-letter system. You have to realize in your own mind, wait, what if I took the 4 letters from this iron spell and combined them with the 4 letters of this polishing spell? Could I polish iron? That kind of thing. And so it's very old school aesthetic. We talked about games with puzzles and story divorced from each other. These are very divorced. The puzzle and the story do not really relate to each other. The story's just there to as dressing for these fun puzzle fests. And so I definitely think that your viewers should check that out as something that's not part of the retro community, but would, I believe, be enjoyable.
Excellent. And you've got the platform now. That not that you lack for platforms out there with IFDB and the different competitions and so forth, but just as part of this conversation, anything you want to put out there in the world of what you'd like to see more of in 2025 and beyond.
Yes, absolutely. The one thing that I love more than anything else is sincerity. I love seeing something where it's very obvious this was a unique individual who had a dream and they put their heart into it, even if it's a bad game. So we've seen this with AI. We've seen this with people taking other tropes and other things like that and trying to make a game like copying other people. And I'm guilty. I copy people all the time. But there's just something so fun about playing a game and just thinking in your head, this author is the only person who could have come up with this. I just love this. So, that's the thing I love more than anything else is for people to just make what's their unique vision, even if other people don't like it. I think it's good to do both. You can make games that cater to the larger community, but I think everybody should try to make at least one thing that's just uniquely them. And I think that's what I would love to see.
Yeah, and you and I are aligned on that in our very first episode when we played The Pawn, which frankly was a game that I'd been led to expect would be a lot better than it was. One of the things that really turned me off about it was how afraid of sincerity it was, and that's something that unfortunately has popped up, in games of the commercial period when frankly there was financial incentive to maybe be more sincere, and B, it didn't really feel like people had earned the sense of burnout that would lead to that. But
right.
Yeah, so I definitely hear you on that front. Of the 3,480 or so reviews that are out there, is there anything that you would point people to if they wanted to get to know you as a reviewer, your taste and your style?
I have 2 or 3 reviews that were very personal for me because I knew the people involved and it deeply affected my own life in different ways. And I hesitate to point to them because in all of them I kind of come off as a jealous or whiny person because that's what I was. There's a few different games where I was in part of different communities and we collaborated together, and then people they worked as a group to make something, and then I ended up not being in the group and stuff like that. And it's not always like this. There's tons of times I've collaborated with others and it worked out really positively. So, but I wrote a lot of those history into the reviews, so they're a lot different than my others, and a lot of people have enjoyed reading them. So those would be the games Where the Water Tastes Like Wine and Moondrop Isle. Both of those were made by large collaborations of people I know and very familiar with, and both are actually pretty fun. You may not have heard of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine because it's not retro, it's not parser, and it's graphical, but it was a game voiced by Sting, which is kind of crazy. And you wandered around as a skeleton across a map of America, and you collect stories in different places. It was really interesting. Moondrop Isle is a more recent game that combines. The author Ryan Veeder found a way to connect like 6 or 7 different parser games with their own virtual machine, where you would seamlessly exit one and enter the other with all the data transmitted. And he got a lot of people to help, including some people you may have heard of, like Carl Muckenhaupt, who ran BAF's Guide in the 90s and wrote the Gostak. So those 2 reviews are probably the ones I put the most effort into.
Anything else that you would like to share with us before we wrap up?
No, just I support everybody that's interested in this niche hobby. The best thing about it, I think, is the people, the interactive fiction community. There's obviously been a lot of disputes over the years, but there's just such a kindness and warmness to newcomers I've seen by a significant chunk of people that makes me always want to come back.
All right, that's been Brian Rushton. Thank you, Mathbrush, for joining us. We will link to your profile and your reviews. ifdb.org is the easiest way to get started. The usernames are kind of alphanumeric hashes here, so there's not a quick way to get there that I know of. But we'll be sure to put those links in the show notes, and really appreciate you taking the time with us on the show.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventure games. This episode was produced and edited by Jason Compton. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, including Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Podcast Addict. Visit us at retroadventurers.com and follow us on Facebook and Blue Sky. The Retro Adventurers is based on a format originally devised by Ben Collier, Jason Compton, and Dave Hawkins.